I am very pleased to introduce our speakers today. The first is Evan Abramson. Evan is a results-driven designer and planner on a mission to rebuild biodiverse ecosystems through pollinator-plant interactions. As founder and principal of Landscape Interactions, he works closely with project partners along every step of the process, from conception and design through implementation and maintenance. Evan has a Master of Science in Ecological Design from the Conway School, certificates in Permaculture Design and Biodynamic Gardening, and is the author of numerous publications, including the Lincoln and Great Barrington Pollinator Action Plans. Mary Sage Napolitan is the Regenerative Landscape Manager at Island Grown Farm, a program of Island Grown initiative on Martha's Vineyard. There, she works to plan, implement, and maintain projects that serve to enhance ecological health, biodiversity, perennial food production, accessibility, and inclusive education in the farm's landscape. Mary Sage earned her Master of Science degree in Ecological Design from the Conway School as well in 2019. And she also works independently as a landscape designer, providing services for landscape-based projects on Martha's Vineyard. So welcome to the two of you, and welcome everyone in our audience. Evan, the floor is yours.
Thanks. I think Mary Sage is going to speak a bit, and then I'll follow.
Great. Thank you, Rosemary, and thanks everybody for joining us today. I'm Mary Sage Napolitan. I am the landscape manager at Island Grown Initiative on Martha's Vineyard. So before Evan really gets into the real content of the project itself, I just wanted to give a little introduction to how this project came to be. Island Grown Initiative is a nonprofit organization on Martha's Vineyard, island off of the south coast of Cape Cod. And we aim to support a regenerative and equitable local food system here on the island. And the Island Grown Farm is really the heart of that organization. At the farm, it's about a 40-acre property, and about 12 acres of that is in intensive production, which largely goes to support our food equity programs and the local food pantry. And it's also where we practice and develop and model these regenerative agriculture techniques that we are trying to support here on the island. And so that largely includes things like low tillage and cover cropping and integrated grazing in the farm system. But we're always really striving to sort of access and expand what that idea of regenerative can really mean, and what our responsibility is as land stewards, as the owners of this farm, in order to really maximize the ecological benefit of our practices here while still maintaining our high yields of nutritious food for our community. So when we use this term regenerative, we are commonly referring to the soil practices, building soil organic matter and soil carbon storage and input reduction. But we feel we really need to always keep interrogating how we embody that regenerative ethic beyond just the cultivated fields, and how we can take a holistic view of the farm system and our potential for ecological restoration in working landscapes, and also sort of really investigate what is the specific niche that a farm landscape can play in this effort for ecological restoration. So that is sort of the thinking in mind that led us to partnering with Evan to develop this plan for enhancing native biodiversity and supporting native pollinators on our farm. But our farm is also an educational site. So we have hundreds of students that come through every year, and volunteers, community members, and other island farmers. And so we also really want to be setting an example of how this environmental care and restoration can be really integrated into productive farm systems. And because we are a nonprofit organization, we also feel that there's a responsibility to acknowledge and leverage what our specific advantages and resources are in developing and promoting something like this project that is specifically appropriate for our farm, but can also be shared and replicated, and try to help remove some of the barriers of entry and the financial restraints that might otherwise limit other small farms from being able to do this type of work. So the aim here is not just to demonstrate, but also create a toolkit that can be used by other farms and other working landscapes to implement this type of biodiversity support all across the island and in other similar regional ecotypes. So these are sort of the goals and considerations that led to this project, as Evan will present it today. Not just a plan for supporting native biodiversity at Island Grown Farm, but also a roadmap to support others in doing the same. And thank you so much for joining us, and I'll let Evan take it from there.
Thank you, Mary Sage. And thank you all for attending in person or at home. So this presentation will be divided into two parts. At the first third or half, I'll talk about the reasons why we focus on native pollinator habitat restoration in all of our work at Landscape Interactions and the science behind that thinking. And then the second half will be focused on the design itself that we did for Island Grown Farm and the ways that other farmers, other landowners, and really anyone with a small piece of land could take a piece of this home to their own property. So where do we live and what's going on in the world today? Humanity's impact on the planet is so profound that we are living in a geological epoch that's named after humans. And the age of the Anthropocene is defined by things like rising carbon emissions, sea level rise, as well as the global mass extinction of species. Currently, as many as 30 to 50% of all species on the planet, whether they're plant or animal, are headed toward extinction by the middle of this century. What this essentially means is that we're facing a potential collapse of nature. 1 million species are threatened with extinction globally, including over half of the native bee species in North America. Insects are essential for all ecosystems, not only as pollinators, but also as food for other wildlife and recyclers of nutrients. And at the current rate of decline, most, not all, but most insect species could vanish within a century. The main reason for this is loss of habitat, which is basically the conversion of nature into something for human use, whether it's a large farm field, a parking lot, a house, urban sprawl, as well as the prevalence and expansion in use of pesticides, including neonicotinoids. To put it in the words of one scientist, we're sleepwalking towards the edge of a cliff. It's not just insects that are facing these severe declines. Since 1970, North America has lost 3 billion birds, which is over 1 in 4 birds in the last 50 years. And again, habitat loss is the most direct cause. According to the UN's Convention on Biological Diversity, which just met in Montreal a couple of weeks ago, there's basically 5 main threats to global biodiversity. And this really is any species that are at risk. The number one threat is changes in land and sea use, which is followed by exploitation of natural resources. Those two together really are habitat loss. It's turning a forest into a clear cut. It's turning a meadow into row crops for farming. That's followed by climate change, pollution, and invasive species. So as a whole, these are also the threats that are most prevalent in places like Massachusetts and throughout the Northeast. We're definitely facing these global issues locally as well. But in order to solve the climate crisis, you really have to solve the biodiversity crisis at the same time. It's not just like changes in climate is affecting biodiversity. Loss of biodiversity, loss of species in a landscape or an ecosystem makes the climate crisis more severe, because when you don't have connected, diverse ecosystems, whether they're wetlands, grasslands, forest, tundra, that you're losing the ability for the local environment to stabilize itself in the event that a disturbance occurs. So to give an example, a wildfire. If a wildfire passes through a landscape and burns everything down, if that landscape is not diverse, if it just contains a handful of plant species, maybe a handful of canopy tree species with very little understory, let's say, and maybe a lot of invasive species, that landscape is going to have a harder time bouncing back, or building back soil, building back land cover, and even the presence of animals or plants or insects if it's not diverse. Whereas if a fire moves through a landscape where there's hundreds of species of plants, dozens, if not hundreds of species of animals and birds and insects, well, yeah, some species might not make it through that wildfire, but other species will. And in fact, they might benefit from that wildfire. And the same goes for other disturbances caused by climate change, like flooding, drought, what have you. So rather than being framed as a victim of climate change, biodiversity is really our best ally in dealing with and surviving the climate crisis. And that's a point I really want you all to take home. So looking at grassland specifically, because this is a farming project and it is on Martha's Vineyard, which is one of the Earth's last remaining sandplain grassland habitats, globally, grasslands hold 20% of our carbon stocks, as well as a third of the world's land-based carbon. So a lot of people think carbon credits, carbon sequestration, they're thinking trees. Well, in fact, grasslands hold a lot of carbon because they're storing that carbon underground in their root systems of grasses and flowers and small shrubs. A 2019 study found that annual tillage in the United States for expanding cropland put as much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere per year as 31 million cars. And another study found that if we could conserve grasslands in the US, we could prevent almost 3 times as much carbon emissions as conserving forests. Soils globally contain over twice as much carbon as the atmosphere and living flora and animals combined. So in other words, what's above the ground growing in trees and being stored in trees and carbon is more than double below the ground that we can't see. And globally, wetlands hold by far the most carbon, and that's held in the soil. 643, I think that's gigatons, versus following closely to that, not second, but maybe third is temperate grasslands. And that's really going to describe any open landscape that's not paved or planted with lawn in the Northeast. So we live in a temperate ecosystem. Grasslands are one of the dominant vegetation types in natural communities following wetlands and forest. Those hold 236 gigatons globally. It's a lot of carbon. Now, also, we talked about fire. If a forest goes up in flames, the carbon is lost to the atmosphere and it's not coming back until that land is, covered in trees again, which can take dozens, if not hundreds of years. Whereas if fire moves through a savanna or grassland landscape, the fire does not release much carbon into the air. It's negligible because most of the carbon is stored underground in the root system. And this here is an image of Indian grass, which is one of the native grasses that we find in Massachusetts. And you can see here that the root system is about 10 or 12 feet deep. So a lot goes underground. This here on the left, this diagram is to scale. So on the left here, this is Kentucky bluegrass. This is your typical lawn grass that you would find in someone's, lawn or a golf course. Compared to this heath aster here, that's one of our native asters. So you can see the difference in the root depth and the difference in the potential of that plant to move nutrients through the soil from the organic layer to the subsoil. And then this is switchgrass, another native grass, and this is little blue stem. So as a whole, our meadow or grassland ecosystems are really doing a lot more below the ground than we realize. Our sort of thesis, in the work that we're doing at Landscape Interactions is really to design or redesign nature. It's to use landscape planning and design to recreate natural ecosystems and to make them beneficial not only to humans, but also to other wildlife. And we really think that the best potential for doing that is in our developed landscapes, whether it's farms, conservation properties that might be in various stages of restoration, suburban and urban parks and green spaces, as well as rural communities, even large-scale solar arrays. These are our opportunities for expanding and improving our regional biodiversity, climate resilience, ecological health, and food security. Because what happens at the pollination scale down here at the bottom, it resounds throughout the food web to all the other trophic levels of terrestrial species. Terrestrial ecosystems depend upon pollination. What these bees, moths, and butterflies and birds are doing down here, as far as producing seeds, feeding, caterpillars, feeding birds, that's going to impact whether these top predators can live on that landscape and have a good diet. And it also affects humans. So why are pollinators so important? As I mentioned, they're primarily insects that fertilize plants, producing seeds and fruit, and over 80% of the world's flowering plants depend upon pollinators for reproduction. In Massachusetts, 45% of our food crops depend upon bees specifically, as well as a third of the food grown in the US. So it's also our food system. And most animals rely upon pollinators for food and shelter because of what they do as far as, allowing plants to reproduce and feeding other animals. And approximately 15% of the bee species in the Northeast are specialists at the family or genus level, meaning that they only pollinate a certain small group of plants. So what are the needs of a bee on a landscape, and how can we create a landscape that supports a native bee and thereby supports this network of, of animals and plants? Over 400 of the 4,000 native bee species found in the US live in the Northeast, and the vast majority of pollination is performed by them. There was a global study, the citation is here at the bottom, Garibaldi et al. 2013. They actually found, they looked at 41 different food crops in 600 different field trials across every populated continent. And they found that wild pollinators were twice as effective as honeybees in producing seeds and fruit. So the misconception that we need honeybees for our food system is really something that needs to be made more well-known. It's really wild bees and wild insects that are doing the vast majority of our food pollination, not honeybees. The average range that a native bee flies from its nest is only about 200 to 1,800 feet, although some bees like bumblebees will go over a mile if they need to. 70% of native bees in the Northeast are ground nesting. Most live alone. They don't have colonies, and they exist in habitats like bare, exposed, well-draining ground, soft pith twigs like in elderberry or Joe Pyeweed, abandoned rodent burrows, and dead trees and snags. This is a diagram from one of our projects in Eastern Massachusetts, where we mapped out the different average ranges of different sizes of native bees from their nest, and where we had different design sites in the community. And you can see here that you really need sites to be relatively close together if you want to have this corridor effect where pollinators or insects can move from one site to the other. Other significant pollinators include animals like the ruby-throated hummingbird, the slender clear-winged moth. That's an example of one of the moth species that's declining regionally, and especially in Martha's Vineyard. It's a species of special concern in Massachusetts. It's a threatened species in Connecticut, and they only lay their eggs on lowbush blueberry, native blueberry. The monarch butterfly only lays its eggs on milkweed. It's facing an 81% population decline globally. The Diane skipper is another example of an at-risk butterfly species. It only lays its eggs on Carex lacustris and possibly Carex stricta, and it only lives in wetlands or wet meadows and swamps. It's also a threatened species. So depending upon the location of the site and which species are at risk in that location, we target our plant list to support those species. So our plant list changes from site to site, depending upon those factors, as well as what kind of landscape it is and what the goals of the landowner are. As I mentioned, honeybees is not really the focus of this work, but I just want to mention here and sort of, hammer in the point. Honeybees are actually, they don't need help. between 1980 and 2005, there was something called colony collapse disorder, and we actually lost half of the honeybee colonies in the United States. But since then, there's been a lot of research and funding that has gone into addressing honeybee decline. And in fact, since 2005, beehive populations in the US have increased and stabilized. So you can see here, especially following 2007, 2008, the numbers really start to go up and then they sort of plateaued. And that's because, well, first of all, if anyone loses their colony, they can just order more and have it shipped to them in the mail. Secondly, millions, if not billions of dollars have gone into honeybee health research. But in a 5-year period between 2010 and 2015, it was found that wild bee abundance in the US dropped by 23%, which is an astoundingly huge amount. And this map here is showing the areas that had the lowest abundance, like the lowest total numbers of wild bees, are the areas in yellow. What's interesting is that those areas are almost exactly the same as the parts of the US that are estimated to have the highest use of neonicotinoid pesticides. So it's really our large-scale industrial agriculture belt in the Midwest, as well as the areas with the densest population density, like the eastern and western coasts, the Central Valley of California, the sugarcane growing region of South Florida. These are the areas where bees are dying the most. And it's because these areas have the most land use change, they have the most loss of habitat, and they have the highest use of pesticides. This widespread use of pesticides in the US is not just affecting native bees, though, it's also affecting honeybees. And more honeybees die in the US every year than all fish and animals raised for slaughter combined. A 2002 study found that organic farms that were located near natural habitat, they did not require honeybees for pollination, even on a crop with very high pollination requirements, which was watermelon. Any other type of farm that was studied as part of this paper needed honeybees, and that's because they either weren't organic or they weren't near natural habitat or both. So if we can farm organically, as I'm sure many of you are already doing, and if we can make sure that our farms don't take all of the natural areas away, that we leave, marginal areas, wetlands, forest edges, fallow fields, or even plant them for pollinators, we're going to really be more resilient in the event that we can't get honeybees to our site, or we don't want to pay for them, or there's no honeybees available because they're all dying from exposure. In Michigan State, they did a study where farmers planted a 1-acre patch of perennial wildflowers on their farms. And they found that during the first 3 years, while the wildflowers were establishing, there really wasn't much of a difference. But by the 4th growing season, the farms that had the flower patches had a 33% higher pollination rate for their blueberries. So it took about 3 years to grow in. At the same time, farmers that were using a lot of pesticides to spray their blueberries, these were not organic blueberry growers, they were able to cut back and save up to $6,000 a year in not needing to use pesticides because of that 1-acre wildflower patch on their farm. This diagram here shows the main genus of native bees that would visit food crops in our area. And you can see here that bombus, which are bumblebees, are the only group that pollinate all major food crops. So they're really, really important, and they're a target for all of our work. According to the UN's FAO, 90% of the world's food supply comes from about 100 food crops species, and 71 of those rely on bees for pollination. So it's really about 270 species of wild bee that are doing the majority of our food pollination globally. And another study came out just a few months ago with some Harvard School of Global Health scientists that actually calculated the number of people every year that were dying because of lack of access to food that was directly correlated with loss of pollination. So it has a global health consequence. As far as honeybees competing with native bees, there's a whole range of studies that you can read that have looked at that. And the sort of takeaway is that conserving honeybees does not help wildlife, and that honeybees compete directly with native pollinators such as bumblebees, hoverflies, other flies, and wild insects in general for the same resources. And it essentially means that, you know, the wild insects are not getting what they need to live because of the honeybee competition on the landscape. So I really encourage people to be choosy about where they put their honeybee hives and to avoid putting them on conservation properties and to really keep them in productive areas like farms, because it does have an impact on wildlife, which is negative. It's like raising chickens to save the birds. Raising honeybees, having honeybees is not helping pollinators that are in decline. It's not going to save the pollinators. It's not going to save the bees. And just like if you had a bunch of chickens on your farm, you're not going to save birds, wild birds. So this is a video of one of our native bumblebee species, Bombus vagans, which is one of the declining species in Massachusetts. And it illustrates a specialized relationship between a pollinator and a plant. This is a bottle gentian, which is a wetland flower. Gentian flowers can only be pollinated. Well, bottle gentians have a closed flower. Only bumblebees are large enough to force their way inside the flower, and only medium and long-tongued bumblebees are able to reach the nectar reward at the base of the flower inside of it, which is where the pollen is located. So if a landscape didn't have bumblebees on it, and it didn't have specifically long or medium-tongued bumblebees, which are not all bumblebees, that's only about half of the bumblebee species, then that flower would not be able to get pollinated, and it would eventually become sterile and disappear from that property. So we have examples of such a relationship across our landscape, and that's why it's really important to consider which pollinator species are declining and which plant species may benefit or may require those declining species to reproduce. That's the difference between a diversity and abundance. So in Massachusetts, we have about 11 species of bumblebee that are commonly, have been commonly documented since, history. There's a few other species, but some of them are hard to identify, like Bombus sandersoni. They oftentimes get confused with Bombus vagans. I'm not going to go into the details, but let's just say we have these 11 bumblebee species, and we're going to look at where they were in Massachusetts before and after the year 2000. So before the year 2000, whether you were looking at Eastern Massachusetts or Western, and you can see here in this map, it's divided by elevation. So the areas that are in beige are lower than 500 feet above sea level. The areas that are in green are between 500 and 1,000 feet above sea level, and the areas that are in orange are about 1,000 to 2,000 feet above sea level. So depending upon whether you're at a certain elevation, you'll have certain bumblebee species on your site. Now, historically, the bar graphs that have the gold bars, you can see that whether we were at high or low elevations, there were 6 to 9 bumblebee species commonly found across the state. Nowadays, in high elevation areas, we're lucky if we see 2, maybe, in some areas there might be 5 to 6 bumblebee species present. A lot of those species were not present historically at all. So like Bombus impatiens, to give the example. Bombus impatiens is the common Eastern bumblebee. Historically, in high elevation areas, you can see the number was almost nothing. Nowadays, it's all the way up to here. In low elevation areas, historically, Bombus impatiens was very abundant, but so were another 6 or 7 species. Nowadays, it's almost all Bombus impatiens. And that is a loss of diversity, that is a loss of biodiversity, and that has an impact across the ecosystem. And it's not just bumblebees, it's other bees, it's butterflies and moths as well. In New York, they just recently completed a statewide pollinator survey where they studied various flies, beetles, moths, and bees. And they found that 24% of native bee species in New York were at risk of extinction from New York State. 11% were already extirpated. They were gone from New York State. They're no longer found. And between 38 and 60% of native bees, flies, beetles, and moths are at risk as well. So we're really living in the age of biodiversity loss, and that's being shown in pollinators. So what one bee wants is not the same for every other bee species. And just because you see a lot of Bombus impatiens on a landscape doesn't mean that that is good pollinator habitat. That's my point. We're also facing a loss of native plant communities. So it's not just pollinators, it's the plants that they depend upon. And presently, about 22% of New England's native plants are either globally, regionally, or locally imperiled or already extirpated, meaning they're no longer there. There was also an interesting study that compared flower and plant observations in Concord, Massachusetts specifically, between comparisons that were done by Henry David Thoreau and Richard Primack in the early 2000s, and they found that 27% of species were no longer present in Concord at all, and 36% of formerly common species were now rare. One other study that I'll make you guys sit through before we get to the designs is in 2020 in the University of New Hampshire, they looked at historical versus contemporary observations, and they found that there was a 94% loss of plant pollinator networks across northern New England, which means that either the plant was no longer present or the pollinator that the plant depended upon, or both. And the authors of that study recommended specifically that pollinator habitat restoration efforts focus on declining species, so species whose numbers are going down. And that's what we are trying to do here. So here's the project with Island Grown Farm, Farming for Biodiversity. It's a scalable, replicable model. So as Mary Sage mentioned, the project took place at Island Grown Farm. It's a 42-acre parcel, about 12 acres are farmed. It's a nonprofit farm, and they do a lot of community outreach. It's also a no and low till farm. So it was the ideal partner for this project. The property is actually pretty diverse. It contains a kettle pond in the southeast corner. It had a forested wetland down here. Almost the entire productive area of the farm is core habitat as identified by the Natural Heritage Endangered Species Program of Mass Wildlife. So in other words, it is important, an important landscape for species that may be at risk or rare or endangered. The location of the farm is also important. It's kind of in the center of Martha's Vineyard, as you can see down here, and it contains a lot of the major soil types that are found across the island. So, you know, this map over here in the top left, the farm is predominantly Haven, Carver, and Riverhead sandy loam. Those three soil types are also the dominant soil types on Martha's Vineyard. Carver covers 34% of the island, for example. So what we do on Island Grown Farm is a great model for what we could do on other farms across the island. And these two maps here show the land use change in Martha's Vineyard between 1971 and 2016. Every black dot on these maps is a current farm, a farm that is active. So land use, as I mentioned, is the main threat to global biodiversity. It's also the main threat to pollinators on Martha's Vineyard. And between 1971 and 2016, developed land on Martha's Vineyard expanded from 11% to 40% of the island's total area. And during that same time, agricultural use shrank from 4% to 2%, so went down by half. So again, this project is a great microcosm for our global issues that we've been talking about. When we began this project, one of the considerations we had was, you know, can we make the native plants that we're using to restore Island Grown Farm's landscape available locally? And in fact, can we collect seeds from them locally and grow them on the farm? And this image is of Mary Sage, who was able to grow about a third of the plants that were in our design during the first growing season in the greenhouses at Island Grown Farm. And so these are the small seedlings that when they were first starting to emerge last spring. The entire design process was informed by scientific research. We were able to obtain very recent surveys of moths on Martha's Vineyard by Paul Goldstein at the National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C. He also is a resident of Martha's Vineyard during the summer. He did comprehensive four decades of studies of moths on Martha's Vineyard to compare which species were declining and which species were not at risk. He also did comprehensive bee surveys. And we also built upon Dr. Robert Jagir's work with bumblebees in Massachusetts, as well as observations by Matt Pelican on Martha's Vineyard of butterfly species over the past 3 decades. And so all of these papers and conversations that we had with leading scientists in these fields informed what were our target species for the project as far as which pollinators were we going to try to quote unquote save or help. And then that in turn resulted in a pretty extensive research process where we researched all of the plants that those pollinators depend upon, whether for pollen, nectar, laying their eggs, as a host plant, or even for nesting. And just to give an example again, these two diagrams, on the top, you have bumblebee observations in southern and central New England by month between 1864 and 1999 compared to 2000, 2022. This is from Dr. Jagir's work at UMass Dartmouth with the Bee Ecology Project. And what you can see here is that between 2000 and 2022, almost every observation is of Bombus impatiens. I mean, look at this line at the bottom. They are off the chart, literally. But historically, they were down here. And they might have been more prevalent during the late season, but there were a lot of other species that were being observed in the 1900s. So this is all part of the process of what we're trying to turn around here. The design for the farm consisted of 8 zones, and they're numbered here in this diagram. So this is the farmed areas of Island Grown Farm. We created field borders. Those are number 1. Those predominantly ran north to south, east to west, and they are about 5 to 6 feet wide, consisting of perennial native vegetation, mostly flowering grasses, flowers and native warm season grasses. Number 2 were the hedgerows. Those are in gold. Those were all running east to west along tractor roads, where we were able to carve out a 10 to 12 foot wide area that was not in production. And all of these areas were areas that were not in production, or they were in very poor production, areas that the farmers identified as not needing to be used by them. And this entire process of determining where we were going to put the habitat was a conversation that occurred over many months between myself, Mary Sage, and the head farmers at Island Grown Farm, so that we were ensuring that what we were proposing was realistic and was desired by them, not us just coming and telling them where we think they should do habitat, walking away, and then finding that they weren't able to do it because it didn't work for their current rotations or their long-term plans. We also created a wet meadow area down here, number 3, 2 grazing areas, which are 4. Those are going to be seeded with all exclusively native vegetation that's palatable to livestock or is not bothered by livestock. In other words, the livestock can graze around it and allow it to flower. We created a design and seed mixes for an orchard and a oak savanna sandplain grassland restoration area, as well as a woodland edge, an area that's fairly shaded, and a mesic meadow in full sun. So each of these areas is part of a multi-year phasing schedule. So you can see everything here in number 1, that's installed the first year. That was installed last fall, either direct seeded in the case of the meadows or planted in the case of the field borders and the hedgerows. Then we're going to be continuing in 2023 this year with areas that are marked out in number 2 and the following year and beyond in areas that are marked number 3. So this is a sort of realistic approach where not too much is needed to be done any given year, and budgets and labor can be considered accordingly. This is our list of target species for the project. We targeted nearly 30 native bee species and about 15 butterfly and moth species each. So about almost 60 species for the project. And this informed a pretty extensive plant list. As far as the designs go, what we found to be the most realistic approach was, the hedgerows, as I showed you earlier, some of them are over 600 or 700 feet long, but there's really no need for that to be a customized design. So what we did was we created a 50-foot running length for the hedgerow and a 50-foot running length for the field border, and then it's just replicated. So it will be replicated, 10 times or 12 times or 14 times across a given area. And that makes it really easy not only to budget for the plants, but also to lay out the plants. So in the case of the hedgerow, they're putting 1 scrub oak every 50 feet, 1 prairie willow every 50 feet, 1 meadow willow every 50 feet, 1 beech plum every 50 feet. 6 purple Joe Pye weed every 50 feet, 4 northern bush honeysuckle every 50 feet. And they're sort of laid out either on center or along the edges so that it's really easy to just, bang this out when you're planting it. Same thing with the field border. The field border is actually, it repeats, if you look closely, it repeats every 12 feet or so within that 50-foot strip. You can see like this is a big blue stem and it occurs, 4 or 5 times. Same thing with the Eutrochium fistulosum, the Joe Pye weed, and other plants. We also have pretty detailed specs in all of our work for bee nesting habitat. We recommend digging down about 4 inches, removing all of the existing vegetation and soil, and then putting back half of the topsoil with sand. And with that, and then just keeping it free and clear of vegetation in a full sun, dry area that will allow ground nesting bees to get underground. And you can site that near native bunching grasses. We also did a design for the orchard area, considering the spacing of the existing fruit and nut trees and shrubs, which are shown here in white, and the plants that would go in between. And then here's a layout concept for how you could lay this out across like a large landscape. So you could have, let's say, a 50-foot hedgerow or field border repeated 3 times, and then a bee nesting strip, and then go again. Just a sort of conceptual layout. And so this is the plant list for the different areas. I'll just rattle off a few names, and you guys can download this on our website for free, as well as a number of our other public-facing projects. The website for that is landscapeinteractions.com/projects. And you can see the first one is Farming for Biodiversity. So don't worry about trying to write down all these names of plants, but the hedgerow, for example, had beech plum, scrub oak, prairie willow, and meadow willow. It also had yellow wild indigo, Baptisia tinctoria, northern bush honeysuckle, shrubby St. John's wort, Carolina rose, Virginia rose, purple flowering raspberry, 2 different species of spirea, low bush blueberry, purple lovegrass, little blue stem, and then a range of native flowers. These are all native species. Butterfly weed, purple Joe Pye weed, slender bush clover, 2 species of bee balm, 2 species of beard tongue, white goldenrod, New England aster, and goat's rue. Whereas, like, for example, the field border didn't have woody species. It's just big blue stem, Pennsylvania sedge, switchgrass, little blue stem, and then a number of native warm season flowers, purple giant hyssop, common milkweed, butterfly weed, Desmodium canadense, purple wood aster, native geranium, northern blazing star, which is Liatris noviangliae, and so on and so on. Some zizias. And this here is what the hedgerow will look like when it's grown in to scale in relation to an individual and a tractor. So you can see here that the hedgerow will max out at about 10 feet height. And if needed, it can be pruned in the winter. Species like scrub oak and willow benefit from pruning, and you can use the cuttings for a number of things. I also did this exercise. I thought it was fun to sort of highlight a different plant from the hedgerow and talk about like what its benefit is. So in the case of the first row, this is the scrub oak that's highlighted, and it's the host plant for a number of at-risk butterflies and moths in Martha's Vineyard, including Horace's dusky wing, white M hairstreak, and possibly oak hairstreak. They haven't determined with the oak hairstreak whether scrub oak specifically is a host or if it's just white oak and post oak. Prairie willow is a really crucial, as with all native willows, are crucial for bees. They provide some of the earliest sources of pollen, and they also provide nectar if they're male plants. And so there's a whole range of bees that need willows for pollen and nectar, including andrinas like Andrina carlini, Andrina crataceae, Andrina forbesi, a bunch more, a number of bumblebees, including Bombus fervidus, Bombus vagans, and then some of the Lasioglossums, and even one of the mason bees. The wild bergamot down here, which is bee balm, is highly visited for nectar, as well as some bees visit it for pollen. And a number of the at-risk bees really prefer to visit it for pollen or nectar or both, including Andrina placata, Bombus fervidus, Bombus vagans, Coleoxys rufitaris, Lasioglossum imitatum, and on. And then little blue stem here at the bottom is an important host plant for the at-risk Leonard skipper as well as other skipper butterflies. Some of them only lay their eggs on little blue stem. This rendering, which we saw at the beginning of the presentation, is showing an example of the field border here on the left of the walking path, and then the grazing area on the right. And you can see here on the far left row crops that are maintained. So this is sort of the way that the plantings are integrated with the existing landscape at IGI Farm. And as I mentioned, you can download this from our website under the projects page at landscapeinteractions.com. These are the complete plant lists for the oak savanna plantings, oak savanna seed mix, the woodland edge plantings, the woodland edge seed mix, the wet meadow plantings, the wet meadow seed mix. And we've even got the grazing mix with some examples of other work we've done with grazing livestock and native vegetation, which I'll talk about in a bit. And this is a couple of screen grabs of the plant list for the Farming for Biodiversity project. It's the most comprehensive plant list that we've ever published at Landscape Interactions. It includes the bloom time for every species, which months it blooms, the color of its flower, its expected height and spread, the type of soils it needs, and the amount of sunlight it needs, as well as the list of the pollinators that each plant supports, and whether it's for pollen, nectar, or host, or all three. So you can check that out. We also have pretty detailed descriptions of the process we use for site preparation, as well as seeding the meadows. And I'm happy to answer any questions about that during the Q&A. We used pigs at IGI that were rotated along the length of the hedgerow to really disturb the soil and eat as much of the existing vegetation as possible, it's mostly weeds and cool season non-native grasses. And we used black silage tarps, 6mm plastic to smother the meadow areas for 5 months. And then for seeding, the seeds were broadcast in the winter, I believe in December. Mary Sage can speak to that. And they were broadcast mixed with sand and a cover crop of winter wheat. And in the back of the plan, you'll find a references section of all the peer-reviewed work, as well as a list of nurseries and native seed suppliers, as well as some of the plant propagation guidelines if you want to grow these plants yourself. I'm almost done. I'll just go really quickly here. This is just an example of a farmscape and where you can put these types of habitats just from like the ground perspective. So this is before, this is after, this is a rendering. We didn't actually do this on the site. This is an example of a hedgerow area, go around a larger field or along a road. Meadow area, a fallow field, which would be a field that's no longer going to be in production. You can even do native species for cover cropping. You can mix in things like partridge sensitive pea, Geranium carolinum, it's a native geranium that's annual, Lobelia inflata, Monarda fistulosa, which is a short-lived perennial, and toadflax. Field borders, number 5. You can do edge habitat. You can even have native plants for orchards, things like pawpaws, American plum, beach plum, those are all edible. There's native gooseberries, there's native blackberries, blueberries, raspberries, pick your own, riparian buffers, nesting areas. So this is all sort of laid out in the IGI plan, but here's an example on the ground with the plant species for each area, that potential plant species. You have a lot more. And as far as the grazing work that we've done, we spent 2 seasons at my property in Leiden, Massachusetts, which is in Franklin County, doing a grazing trial where we actually documented native plant species growth and whether native plant species flowered or produced seeds in the case of grasses or flowers after they were exposed to livestock rotationally grazing every 6 weeks for a period of 5 months. And so we did 1 season, and then we burned the site through a partnership with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And then we brought the livestock back in right after the burn. That's a methodology of grassland restoration called patch burn grazing. And you can see here, all these pictures were taken the same growing season of the burn. So just a few months after the burn, the landscape went from this to this. And the little blue stem and Indian grass and the native flowers were out of control. And these are areas that were being grazed by livestock repeatedly. I had 7 sheep and a llama in 3/4 of an acre rotation, moving the brake line every 1.5 days and moving them into a new paddock every 7 days. So they were only in the same spot 1 week at a time every 6 weeks. And what we found is that over 24 species of native grasses and flowers were not only able to be documented during and after grazing, but they produced flowers and seeds. And that includes species like native yarrow, common milkweed, Pennsylvania sedge, several different species of goldenrod and aster, several different species of native blackberry and raspberry, native willow, cinquefoil, St. John's wort, Spirea alba, Spirea tomentosa, and lowbush blueberry. So you can definitely feed livestock and pollinators at the same time while building soil carbon, improving nutrient flow and water retention. And then this is what the site looked like at the end of the second growing season. It was a lot of little blue stem. And then that's me on the tractor there. I mowed it all down. I raked it with a landscape rake, which is a little bit more aggressive than a harrow rake. And then I direct seeded it with native seed mixes that I created. And this is mixing the native seeds, weighing them out and breaking them out so that they're evenly distributed across the site. We mix them with parboiled rice hulls, PBH, which you can get from most nursery or farmers cooperatives. It's about $50 for 50 pounds, and 50 pounds goes a long way. I mean, you can do like 2 to 4 acres with 50 pounds. This is what the seeds looked like after we broadcast them. We did them after a light snow last January, so we were able to see where we had distributed them and make sure that we were distributed them pretty evenly across the landscape. And during last year's growing season, we could start to see signs of the plants coming in. Things like lupin and butterfly weed were pretty quick to take off, and the partridge sensitive pea. So I'm about done here. This is our website, landscapeinteractions.com. As I mentioned, you can go to landscapeinteractions.com/projects and download the Farming for Biodiversity project for free, as well as about 5 or 6 other projects we've done over the past 3 years, and see all the plant lists and the site guidelines and the whole process that we did for that.
Thank you so much, Evan. Is Mary coming on now?
Are we both able to speak together, or I think we were going to do that. We were going to do the Q&A together, I think.
Yes, absolutely. Do you mind not sharing your screen
Sure.
so we can see you? Okay, great. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for that presentation. That was just so informative, and it's really fun to see what you came up with for that toolkit. Just want to give a quick round of applause. Awesome. Yeah. So, do you want to take questions now, or Mary, did you have anything you wanted to add before we jump into the Q&A?
Not specifically. No, I think it would be great. We could open it up to questions and see where that takes us.
Fantastic. Okay. Does anyone in the room have something they'd like to ask? Here.
Yep. Hi. I have a question. Great presentation. Very informative. I learned so much. Very inspiring. I have a question specifically when broadcasting the native seed into a field. I know we discussed different methods on how to do it, but the latest slide that Evan showed the seed being broadcasted just kind of into the cut blue stem grass. Is that a way that you found successful for most of the seeds to take, that the little blue stem didn't crowd them out and the other grasses didn't crowd out the seeds?
Yeah, that's a great question. To be honest with you, we'll probably get the most info this year because the first year tends to be kind of slow as far as the native plant growth. But I think that, so you sort of have, there's kind of like 2 approaches you can take. You can go with the let's get rid of everything completely and seed into like pure, clean soil. Or let's try to like, seed into like some existing plant communities that are desirable that we don't want to lose. And I chose to do that because about 70% of my field is native. So I couldn't, possibly, nor did I have the ability to kill it all off, nor did I want to. Whereas like at IGI, the areas that we chose to do the seeding this first year were dominated by non-native vegetation, like weeds, perennial weeds, annual weeds, and cool season non-native grasses like, orchard grasses or Timothy grass or bluegrass. So we felt comfortable smothering and then seeding. And I've done that as well at other sites. The approach of seeding into the blue stem is highly risky. I don't think that I'm going to get more than a fraction of survival in those areas, but there were other areas of the site where it was more thoroughly removed, the vegetation, like through scraping, and those areas tend to show the most success, at least the first season. Blue stem certainly does want to crowd out those other plants, but what I did and what I recommend anyone doing after seeding a meadow, I spent all of this past summer mowing every month. So then we went into drought and I was able to like take a 2-month break, but I basically brush hogged the entire 9-acre field once in May, once in June. Then we went into drought. I skipped July and August, and then I did another one in September when the cool season started to come back in. And that's a lot of work. It's a lot of work, especially on the rolling hills where we live. But it's needed because you need to let those seedlings get light, because the blue stem will just, or any plant will just keep trying to grow. So like Mary Sage is going to be looking at with her areas this year, she's going to have to probably, knock them down, mow them down. When they get to be about 10 or 12 inches tall, like the average height of the vegetation, you knock it down to like anywhere between 4 and 6. So that's best done with like a brush hog or a weed whacker. You don't want to use like a lawnmower because those tend to cut pretty short. Or you could even use a scythe, although I've never done that. And what that's going to do is allow the seeds to keep getting light, keep growing, keep germinating. And then the second growing season, you probably want to do like at least 1 cut in the spring, maybe 2. And then by June 1st, you can kind of like let it go and let it start to grow in, and the existing plants can start to grow in, because if they're cool seasons, they're not going to grow much after June 1st. And then again, the second growing season, you might need to mow it again in like September, October.
Well, thank you so much. I actually have a part B of that question. It's slightly different. But do you have a good resource for starting native seed in an unheated greenhouse? It's very different than starting from indoors.
These were started outside. You have to stratify most native plant species except for the grasses and some of the flowers. So the seeds. So if you go to the Farming for Biodiversity, if you just download it from our website, the last page has about 4 or 5 tutorials that you can go to. One of them is from the Wild Seed Project. One of them is from Prairie Moon Nursery, and there's a couple others. And they'll give you the step-by-step. Essentially, and Mary Sage could speak to this, you're basically putting them outside for the winter.
Yeah, I would recommend starting with, as Evan mentioned and is in the toolkit, the Wild Seed Project and the Prairie Moon both have really good guidelines around each species need for stratification. So every species, has a different length of time that it needs exposure to the cold. And often the moisture as well. So I started everything outside and kind of timed it out based on, started with the things that need the longest. You can start in the fall. And then the greenhouse ends up being a resource. The part of the greenhouse that I brought things into is also unheated. And it ended up just being that I brought things in like around early March, and that just helped accelerate things a little bit. Once they'd already stratified and germinated, the unheated greenhouse kind of just like gives you a little head start in terms of getting those plants to a size you want them earlier in the season.
Great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, one of my favorite nurseries in the world who have the most amazing plants is Wing and a Prayer Nursery in Cummington, Massachusetts, run by Amy Pulley. And she doesn't have any heated greenhouses, and she runs a nursery, as a business.
Yeah, and you can totally do it without a greenhouse at all. And really all it means is like your plants, you're setting yourself up for mostly planting in the fall, which is fine. Or, even doing 2 years of propagation and planting out 2-year-old seedlings.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Russ, you had your hand up earlier.
So as you know, there's a lot of initiatives out there to try to get individual homeowners to plant native in their yards. And one of the big bottlenecks is obtaining plants and seed and stuff like that for that. And so as you may know, that some programs like Project Ecotype in Connecticut has established ways of creating plants and seed that are available for homeowners and engaging organic farms in that effort to set up, growing plugs of the plants that can be made available to homeowners. And their argument is it's an entirely new business for organic farms, used to selling crops directly to people. You could be selling native plants directly to people for planting in the yards, just like you're selling like little broccoli starts for their home gardens. You could be selling, little flats of wild strawberries, whatever native plants are. And so you're developing all this great capacity to grow native plants at island grown. I'm wondering if you thought of, beyond meeting the immediate needs of your farm, what potential phase 2 you might do that would involve, reaching homeowners in the island.
Yeah, so that's a great question. It is a very real thing that almost everybody, the ultimate thing they come up against is that these plants are just not available to buy in the quantities that you need them. We fortunately do the local arboretum does a very good job supporting the homeowner element of this effort, propagating as much as they can, but we have found all of that to be true. And so at the same time that we were developing this project with Evan, we also had a staff member here who does a lot of our sort of financial work and business development come up with a sort of speculative business plan for what that might look like. So we took basically what we learned from my experimenting with propagating this first year and the data we collected from that. He kind of extrapolated that out to see what it would take to turn that into a business, to be generating plants beyond just what we need internally. It would involve at least one additional staff member because I can't be a full-time propagator, but that definitely is a big piece of this, that we're kind of seeing what the right role that we can play in that kind of specific part of this is. And then beyond that, another big piece of this is that we have a really awesome team of volunteers that signed up to help collect seeds locally that I can use to propagate here on the farm. But on top of that, we also have a really great community seed library that largely is stocked with seeds that that team of volunteers collects from their home gardens for mostly food crops. But using that same team of volunteers this year, we also added a native seed section to that local seed library, and we're hoping that we can keep growing that out. So even if we or anybody can't necessarily propagate all of the plants that we might need on the island, at least we're kind of developing this stock of seeds that newcomers into this effort can go there to get what they need to get started, because it's also tough, especially on the island. The goal is to mostly be using local seed because we are sort of genetically isolated. It can be specific in that way. So we can't, there's no way to buy that Martha's Vineyard local genotype seed anywhere. So the hope is that at least we'll have this island Martha's Vineyard specific seed bank going at the library that people can take from as well.
Very cool. Thank you. You have any questions?
Yes. So you talked about using getting invasives when you were preparing your fields, and you talked about the use of pigs. Can you talk a little bit more about how you use the pigs and what type of species or how long they have to be on the ground to get rid of some of the invasives?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I can't. So the pigs are pigs that two of the employees that live on the farm, they keep pigs every year anyway. And so we have noticed in the places that they have them that vegetation gets extremely destroyed by their being there. And so generally they would choose places where either that was already okay to destroy or places that did have a lot of invasives in. And so this past year, we decided to try that out as an intentional site prep method since we were going to have them on the farm anyway. So they do 2 or 3 pigs in fenced in to an area that requires them to get moved. It's like every 3 or 4 days they would get moved along. Basically, once there's nothing left, they just keep scooting them along. And they were on the farm from I want to say late May until early September. And they just moved down that entire length of about 600 feet of hedgerow at that rate, whatever that, that 3 or 4 months was. And they did a pretty good job. We had them in an area that was extremely compacted to start with, and it made it really hard for them to root around. So what ended up happening was actually before the pigs even came in, I realized it was actually when I was staking out where the hedgerow was going to be, and I realized I couldn't even hammer a stake into the ground, that they probably were going to need some help. And so we went through and chiseled that stretch first with the tractor, just to get it broken up a little bit, and that kind of encouraged them to be able to root around. And then afterwards, once they were out of there, prior to planting, I laid down a pretty thick layer of, I want to say 2 or 3 inches of wood mulch to kind of keep that ground soft and hopefully prevent too much weeds from coming back. But I think it will be in this next coming year will be when we have some real results to see how good of a job they did in terms of actually removing the invasives or just kind of cutting them down. But historically, they're such prolific rooters that they usually are really good at that.
There's a question in the chat that I just want to get to from Alexander Pine. He asked, what are the benefits of using native plants as cover crops for fertility soil compared to traditional agricultural cover crops, and how to terminate them? I'll be honest with you, I haven't gotten anyone to do that yet, so I can't say, but all of the cover crops I recommended, I think all of them are nitrogen fixing. They're native legumes, so you have those benefits. And certainly a lot of them will have deeper roots than non-native cover crops, and they are going to benefit they're going to attract more insects to your site than if you just have like a monoculture of clover and vetch and peas. So you're going to get the benefits of, crop pest predation and pollination. I believe I would recommend, if you're going to use native plants in a cover crop, are going to be a lot more expensive. They are going to be 10, 20 times more expensive than buying your standard cover crop. So I wouldn't recommend doing it unless you're okay with it being there for at least 2 or 3 years, like doing more of like a long-term cover crop, because they'll just self-seed. And in that event, I think you'd really see more of the soil fertility benefits, because you'd have them, having the opportunity to get down a little deeper, especially like things like the short-lived perennials, like the Monarda, that will really start to, grow in strongly the second growing season. So I would say that's sort of an experiment that hasn't really been trialed yet, is native cover cropping.
Yes.
Thanks so much. That was great. Do you have any resources on what native plants might be safe or not safe for grazing livestock?
Did you hear the question?
Yeah, I raise sheep, and the only plants that are toxic to them are in the, the prunus family, like the prunus genus, like, cherries, native, non-native or native cherries, if the leaves are wilted. So if you have even like a regular cherry tree or a black cherry or a plum tree, what you don't want is to let sheep get access to a branch that falls off of that tree. Or if you cut it or prune it, you don't want to leave it on the ground where they go, because if they eat the leaves, once they die and wilt, they can die pretty quickly. Other than that, I don't really know of any known toxicity of any plants to sheep, native or non-native, to be honest with you. People say things like, oh, you shouldn't let your sheep get too close to the milkweed, or you shouldn't let your sheep get too close to this or that. They don't eat it. I had them out there going in and around tons of milkweed and other things. They just don't eat what they don't want to eat. They don't kill themselves trying to eat things that they shouldn't. Horses, you absolutely have to be fastidious about not having any milkweed or lupin. Those two will absolutely kill horses. So I did a project for a horse farm in Maine, and I couldn't even put those plants into anything. We just had to remove them completely from the landscape. There was nothing with milkweed or lupin. As far as cattle goes, again, the behavior of cattle tends to be more similar to like, a buffalo, where they're going to be lighter on the land as far as what they're going to eat. They're going to go around things that they don't want, and they're going to do a really good job of trampling and fertilizing the soil with their weight and with the large amounts of manure. And for goats, again, like I don't think that toxicity is really a major issue. So I've looked into this. I won't say I've spent weeks studying it, but I've spent some time and I've spoken to a lot of people, and I can't really find a long list of plants that are toxic to those typical livestock species besides horse.
Thank you. Did you still have your question? Did you still have your question? Or was it answered?
No, I was just gonna say that there are definitely plants that are toxic. So mountain laurel is very toxic. Rhododendron is very toxic. You typically won't eat it if there's other green stuff around, but in the spring, particularly when the things are first starting to green out, like mountain laurel can remain green all winter, and they'll eat it, and they can die from it.
Yeah, that's true. I forgot the mountain laurel and the rhododendron, but those were not in the plan, so I didn't. We didn't use those. But yes, that's a really good point.
So earlier you talked about the predominance of the bombus impatiens as compared to the other bees, and I'm wondering the extent to which that has to do with the bees interacting with each other. I mean, is the bombus impatiens aggressive, and it is forcing the other bees to get out of the place where the bombus impatiens is? And if so, among all the plants, including native plants that people are planting, are there any species out there that might be favoring the bombus impatiens instead of the bees that really need the help?
Yeah, I don't know of any competition directly between like, different native bee species, and each other. I mean, there are nectar robbers. There are certain species that will rob nectar from flowers, thereby preventing other species that might be looking to pollinate those flowers from, being able to get a reward by visiting them. But, and there's also the, the parasitic species. There are species of cuckoo bee that will actually kill the queen of a different species and then put their eggs, or they'll eat the eggs of the other species and put their eggs in the nest and then get the queen of the other species to raise their eggs for them. Sort of like a derelict parent that doesn't want to take care of their own kids, but they've survived like that. But as far as the plant question, absolutely there's a difference. So for example, Bombus impatiens, it's a true generalist species. It will pollinate almost anything with a flower. It will pollinate ornamental flowers, ornamental cherries, farm crops, pretty clover, anything really that you would see, dandelions, like just stuff that's out there, flowers on the landscape, any flower, Bombus impatiens will go to almost always. Whereas a lot of these other bumblebees, the reason why they're declining is because they have more specialized preferences. They might prefer tubular flowers, like a native beer tongue, or they might prefer flowers that only bloom at a certain time of the year. A lot of these solitary bees, they only come out for a few weeks. They might just come out in May or might just come out in October or September. So when we see a lot of bees on the landscape, it tends to be Bombus impatiens and honeybees are like the dominant two species because they're both very generalized in their preferences. They'll go to pretty much anything that's got nectar or pollen. And that's the difference. If you plant plants on the list that we're using for this project or any of our other projects, you're going to be supporting species that need those plants, and the Bombus impatiens may or may not visit those plants, but they are going to be visiting all the other stuff that's already out there. That's not on our plant list, if you kind of catch my drift. And in some cases, the Bombus impatiens can't get to the pollen or the nectar in some of these flowers because their tongue is short. So like they couldn't, for example, pollinate the bottled gentian. And I don't think that they go a lot to the beer tongues because those are pretty tubular. So there are certain flowers that support that are not able to be visited by the more common bee species. And then it's just more a matter of getting a diversity of plants so that at least everyone can have something. Like we can't guarantee that these other species will not come, but at least we're offering the range of flowers and plants that this wide range of species needs, rather than just having a landscape that's like all clover and grass, for example.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, go please.
So I'm wondering if Solidago odora is on your list if you planted that at Island Grove Farm, because I have seen that going wild on the vineyard.
Yeah, we've got the showy goldenrod, the seaside goldenrod, the white goldenrod, and maybe the sweet goldenrod. I can double check.
Solidago odora, the licorice scented golden.
That's the sweet goldenrod.
Right.
Yeah. Is it on the plant list? We can take a look. I think it was. What I've been going off of is what Rob has been telling me for bumblebees, because they do tend to prefer the showy.
Right.
But
It is on his list.
yeah. Let's see here. I've got early goldenrod, showy goldenrod, seaside, white goldenrod. I didn't use Solidago odora for this one But you know, the data is changing a lot. Like right now, we're using Solidago odora and not the showy for a project, I think in Wellesley, because he got more data this growing season and he found that there was more of a preference for that. So it's like it's changing a lot when you get down into the very, very detailed decisions.
So I
I have used Solidago odora a lot in past projects. Like it's
Okay.
definitely on a lot of our plant lists.
So I have seen wild populations of the Solidago odora growing on the vineyard. So I will try to remember exactly where they are. They're growing underneath power lines, which is where I often see it. And so I'll give that information to Mary Sage. So she'll be able to collect the seed if she wants.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Philip?
I have a question for Mary Sage, back to the pig project. I
Mm-hmm.
took out 2 to 3 inches of wood chips, but then it was time to sow a few months later. Did you have to break those aside? What
The
happened?
wood chips were not where we
Oh.
did the seeds. It's where we did the planting. The-
Just the hedgerow, yeah. So I was able to just plant, that was all with
That was shrubs and
with live plants, yeah. So
Okay.
instead of planting and then mulching, I mulched and then planted.
mulch and planted. Okay,
Yeah.
that's right. Thank you.
Mhm.
Yeah, the areas that were seeded, I don't even think the tarp was removed until like when, like November, October, November?
Yeah, like, yeah, it was big areas. So I started early November and then was, working my way through it all the way up until late December to get it all off. And then what I will say about the hedgerow is even with the mulch, it does start to break down that wood mulch. And I started with, relatively already degraded wood chips. And so I would be comfortable direct seeding some stuff right on top of there and seeing what comes of it. Not something like a meadow, but in the case of the hedgerow, there's, some of the ground covers.
Yeah,
I still will just sow it right on there. And often, I see weeds growing out of the wood chip piles all the time. So I'm hopeful that other things will too.
Yeah, that's true as it breaks down. Yep, thank
Yeah.
you.
Awesome. We have, oh, that's, yeah.
Yes, but will we have access to the video recording so we can review the slides again?
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah, all the sessions are being recorded and they will be made available to everyone who registered, probably a couple weeks after the conference is over. It takes a little time to get them up and
Of course.
downloaded, yeah. But yes, they will be available.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? Let's see, oh, yeah, maybe.
I was wondering if
I asked some questions on the Q&A.
Karina, just one moment. We had someone who was starting to speak. It just, yeah.
I was wondering if you can talk more about the patch burn grazing process.
Could you talk more about the patch burn grazing process, how that worked?
okay, sure. Yeah, there's a really good book you can get if you want to really like learn a lot from years of trials. Chris Helzer, Helzer, wrote a book published by the Nature Conservancy. He's based in the Midwest in like the tall grass prairies of, I think, Nebraska, and he's one of their land managers. And his book is called like Prairies of the Central United States or something like that. If you just look for Chris Helzer. The way that it works is that, following a burn, by Russ, native grasses and flowers, the kinds of native grasses and flowers that grow in open fields, like as opposed to like spring ephemerals, those tend to actually prefer burning. They're what's known as fire adapted. So they evolved, over millions of years on our continent in a fire ecology where there was probably a lot of, we don't know, but probably lightning and large disturbances caused by things like large mammals and maybe even predating mammals. Plants go back millions of years. So the fire comes through, it only usually burns down like not even a quarter of an inch into the soil. I've seen frogs hopping right across the field like 20 minutes after the burn, and you can walk right onto the land like right after the burn passes through, and it's like it's cool to the touch. So immediately the vegetation starts to grow back, and especially native warm season grasses and flowers, like things like blue stems and the other flowers that we're talking about. And so the livestock, if you put them on the field after a burn, they'll actually prefer to graze in the areas that were burned. Like if it was like burned here and not there. So the patch burn grazing describes the process where a fire will not burn everything evenly in most cases. It might like have a very intense little spot here, and then like a few yards away, barely anything burned, or only certain things burned. Either it was too wet, there wasn't enough biomass, like there wasn't anything for it to burn. So like if you mow a lot and you try to burn it, it's not going to burn because it needs biomass, for example, or if it's just rained, or if it's shaded. So that phenomenon of patch burn grazing describes the process where a landscape is allowed to sort of naturally carry the fire where it wants to go within the control of not letting it get into the trees. We mowed a brake line around the field about 8 feet wide and then raked it with a York rake so that there was like no leaves, and we leaf blowed. The fire team leaf blowed all the leaves out of the brake line so that the fire would absolutely stop before it hit the forest edge. Whereas we did burn in the understory of like these really tall white pines and stuff. And the livestock then are put onto the field, and they're going to go to the areas that have the new growth, the fresh growth, and that's going to be the areas that were burned. And so the phenomenon is describing the process where you would burn, you'd put the livestock on the field, and then you'd basically rotate them, at a pretty good rate, and move them across the landscape and do that. And then the next season, either let it rest or burn a different area or try a different combination. And it's like this combined approach of using livestock and fire to mimic like the typical ecology of our open landscapes in North America that predate the arrival of not only settlers, but even the arrival of Native Americans. I mean, this goes back way, way before us. Humans have only been here for about 10,000 years, they say. So these plants were here millions of years ago. And so I'm going to be burning my field again, in probably the next 2 years.
Awesome. Thank you, Evan. We're coming up on time, but Karina, I wanted to let you ask your question, and that will probably be the last question we'll take today. Are you there, Karina?
Okay, yeah. This, I guess, is for Mary. Do you do anything to protect the bee nesting areas from trampling? Because in the middle of the hedgerows, I imagine people would want to use them as pathways or breaks in the hedgerows.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm still in the process of constructing them, but I have one. I ended up making sort of like wooden frames, sort of like as if it was almost a raised bed, but like, very short, just so it has some kind of boundary that is like identifiable to people. And that then that also gives me like an edge to fill in with the sand. That is what they're looking for. And then another piece of this is, I think that beyond that, we probably will end up creating sort of a educational signage campaign for all of these features, because I think that you're right that there's definitely going to be an instinct to want to walk right through there, especially as everything's getting established. It doesn't look as exciting as we feel that it is quite yet. So I think that you're right. There probably will be a need to really identify that, but I'm seeing now that just having that wooden frame around it, at least it's not just a bare patch of ground.
Yeah, we spec out, in the design, you can frame it out with 2x4s, but in reality, a sign that says like native bee nesting, please don't disturb, would probably do the same thing.
Awesome.
Yeah, I'm sure you guys will have some great signs. Really excited to see that.
Catchy headlines.
Catchy headlines, yes.
You can get all those like elementary school kids that come to do work on the farm to each make their own.
Exactly. There's nothing better than signs and like kids handwriting.
Perfect idea. Well, Mary and Evan, thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you very, very much. It was just an awesome presentation. So amazing to hear what you are up to. And thank you everyone online, everyone in the room for being with us today too. I hope you enjoy your lunch and the rest of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.